people think they know this story.
Bernie Madoff has been arrested.
They think it's a story about one man.
There is no way you can run a $50 billion Ponzi scheme and not have anybody else know about it.
Madoff was the scapegoat for the financial crisis. But in a blue-collar crime, the bodies drop before you investigate. In a white-collar crime, they drop afterwards.
Bernie fed on being the guy.
They always wanted to please everybody. They didn't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg.
And the choice he made was he could live with himself as a liar much more easily than he could live with himself as a failure.
He had his handful of soldiers create fake trading documents to give to the SEC.
Look at the numbers. It's impossible that he's trading in the volume that he says he is. If you're getting good returns, people knew not to ask too many questions.
We need a smoking gun.
The big banks, the regulatory agencies completely failed.
If you are the watchdog, you have totally and thoroughly failed in your mission.
Bernie is managing money for some of the world's most dangerous people.
He told me if I am wrong, I have no out. I am a dead man. People lost everything.
What am I going to do? I was in my mid-70s already.
To lose your life savings in a house too, it's terrible.
One thing every one of them was, which everybody in the industry is, they're greedy.
Trust, betrayal, pure evil. 100 years from now, people will remember this story.
That was the trailer for the new Netflix docu-series Madoff, The Monster of Wall Street. And this is Factual America. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood. Each week I watch a hit documentary and then talk with the filmmakers and their subjects. Bernie Madoff had it all. A successful career on Wall Street, the all-American family, along with wealth and fame. But from the very beginning, he risked it all by running what became the world's biggest Ponzi scheme, in the process destroying many people's lives, including his own. Join me as I discuss Bernie Madoff with Oscar-nominated and two-time Emmy-winning filmmaker and documentary pioneer Joe Berlinger, executive producer and director of the new Netflix docuseries Madoff, The Monster of Wall Street. Along the way, we pick up some investing tips, learn how to properly pronounce Bernie Madoff's name, and how to make a film about financial fraud sexy. Stay tuned. Joe Berlinger, welcome to Factual America. How are things with you?
Very good, thanks. Looking forward to the end of the year.
Yeah, I think we all are. Just to remind our listeners and viewers that we're talking about the film Madoff, The Monster of Wall Street. It's a new Netflix docuseries premiering on January 4th. So welcome again, Joe. It's an honor to have you on, and maybe you can get us started since no one's had a chance to see this yet, except myself and a few other lucky people out there. What is Madoff, The Monster of Wall Street all about? It's got a good Netflix title, kind of says it all in a way, but maybe you can give us a synopsis of
it's actually, I would call it Madoff, The Monster of Wall Street, because it's Bernie Madoff, although some people do call him Bernie Madoff, but I would say it's Bernie Madoff.
Okay.
But it's a deep dive into the world's largest Ponzi scheme that happened in 2008. Bernie Madoff stole $64 billion, and people don't really fully understand the story. And I wanted to take it on. I've kind of am known for the true crime thing, and I've come off of a whole series of serial killer shows about Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy.
Right.
Etc. And, those take their emotional toll. And I wanted to focus on a financial serial killer this time, because that's what I think of. Bernie is a financial serial killer. The level of destruction on people's lives was horrendous. And there are actually really, there's, of course, a couple of great scripted dramas, most notably The Wizard of Lies, that was on HBO, that covered this story. But hasn't really been a deep dive dissecting the actual Ponzi scheme the way I think we do in the show. And more importantly, people who know the story of Bernie Madoff and the historic largest Ponzi scheme in history, $64 billion, somehow the story has morphed into this idea that this guy was this incredible evil genius who single-handedly scammed people out of that much money. But what the doc series really goes into, I think for the first time, is just the level of co-conspirators and level of ineptitude and malfeasance on Wall Street that allowed him to flourish for so long. And it just seemed like, I couldn't imagine that the show would be coming out around the time of yet another financial fraud, the FTX scandal with Sam Bankman-Fried. But it's interesting that this has happened because, as the Bernie Madoff show demonstrates, people just look the other way when greed is involved.
Yeah. I mean, so since I think that's excellent because it answers all those questions. Why make this now? What is it that we're going to see that wasn't already shown in the past, or at least covered in the news media? I mean, who got rich besides Madoff and his, and maybe his family and closest conspirators? It's a wider web, as you point out in the series.
Yeah, I mean, certainly all of the hedge funds, and there were about 70 in the United States and 200 outside of the United States. In fact, the fraud was bigger outside the United States, meaning European money coming into Bernie's hedge fund. There was a lot of institutions that were making a lot of money on him, and one of the reasons and one of the great red flags is the way it worked and the way the hedge fund industry worked is that there were this thing called feeder funds. Hedge funds would collect money from investors and pool it together and then send it to Bernie as the money manager to invest in what they thought was his, incredibly successful fund. What they didn't know is it was all a Ponzi scheme. But the lack of due diligence on the part of these hedge funds was incredible. They all looked the other way because Bernie offered them that they could keep all the fees themselves. Normally when a feeder fund sends money to Bernie to invest, or to any hedge fund to invest, they split all the fees, and the fees are quite rich. It's the 2 and 20 rule. Normally a hedge fund would, keeps 2% of the assets. So if there's $1 million, they keep 2% of that, and it's a lot more than $1 million. And if the $1 million then grows to $2 million, they get 20% of that increase. Normally that's split between the feeder fund and the investing hedge fund. But Bernie said to the people bringing him the money, you keep all the fees, don't worry about it. I'll just make money on the trades. And not to get too technical here, but the money on trades is a very thin margin. The real money is keeping a percentage of the assets and keeping a 20% of the profits. And he let everyone keep that money. So hard questions weren't asked by all the pooled funds that invested into Madoff. Basic questions, about the viability of the fund. So, we saw, greed in operation here.
I mean, that's really what it gets down to, isn't it? Just in many ways, just pure greed. Because, I mean, I think you have one person on camera, but talking about his own father, really, but says if it's too good to be true, then it is. I mean, here you have all these. Everyone says this is too good to be true, but they carry on feeding funds to him and looking the other way.
Totally. I mean, that's a basic rule that I hope all viewers will take away from this. If something looks too good to be true, it probably is. Bernie reported that 96.4% of the time he was profitable. That's just not how finance works. You have good years and bad years, but nobody is consistently profitable. That was a major red flag. I mean, all sorts of red flags. He was using a conservative options strategy called the split strike conversion strategy, which I won't bore you unless you want me to explain it, but it's actually a very conservative strategy. And yet he was using this conservative strategy to make outsized gains, and nobody questioned that. And most glaringly, because it's an options strategy, options are derivatives of stocks, the size of his fund would have dictated that if he's using these options, he would have to be using more options than are actually in existence. And that should have been a red flag. And then there was the institutional or regulatory ineptitude. I mean, there's one particular character in the show named Harry Markopolis who was now he's a fraud investigator, but at the time he worked for a competitive hedge fund. He's a mathematician, and his job was to try to create products to market. And he took a look at the marketing materials for Bernie's hedge fund and thought within 4 minutes that this doesn't feel right, that there's no way that these kinds of profits can be made with this strategy, and called it a hedge fund, called it a Ponzi scheme within, the first 5 minutes of analyzing the numbers, and then took it upon himself to go to the SEC not once, but a dozen times, pointing out all of the problems, and the SEC just ignored it repeatedly. I mean, that's the thing about the most remarkable thing about this story is that it's, government regulators, whistleblowers, none of that brought Bernie down. What brought Bernie down was a once in a lifetime Black Swan event, which was the financial crisis of 2008. The mortgage market meltdown caused all hedge funds and many investors, they wanted to get out of anything they were invested in and stockpile cash. That's what happens in a massive meltdown, the likes of which we hadn't seen since the Great Depression in 2008. And it was only because people were calling in their chips because of an other situation, the mortgage meltdown, that people called in to redeem their money, that Bernie got caught with his pants down. Because a Ponzi scheme, by definition, is you bring new investor money in to pay off old investors, because in fact you're not doing any investing, you're just sitting on cash and using it for your own purposes. And if you have more new investors putting money in than old investors cashing out, or redeeming some or all of their money, which is normal. You're a fund, and some people come in and some people come out, and that's the name of the game. But if you have more people taking their money out than are putting their money in, then the scheme collapses. And that's what happened as a result of the mortgage meltdown of 2008.
And that mortgage meltdown was also a product of lack of regulatory oversight or proper regulation. So, I mean, that's
the thing I hope people understand, that you have to take control of your own money, and you have to truly understand that Wall Street is a for-profit business. They're not here to be your friend or to put their arm around you and take care of you. And all these commercials that talk about, your wonderful retirement and we're going to get you there. They're not there as an advisor or a friend. They're there to make money off you. And most people do it legitimately, but there's a lot of greed and funky stuff that goes on. And you just, obviously if you got your, I trust Charles Schwab or Fidelity or the big institutions that have your money, I think all do a really good job of doing the right thing. But it's anything that seems a little different, people need to be wary of, because often it's fraud. And ironically, we've seen it just happen again with FTX, and and the similarities are pretty stark. You have an outside entity, somebody with these sophisticated investors taking money from other people, giving it to FTX without any oversight. And Sam Bankman-Fried was taking that money and using it to shore up his hedge fund. And the whole thing came tumbling down. Now, it wasn't, what he was doing wasn't really a Ponzi scheme, but the similarity about something seeming too good to be true, eliciting the emotion of greed in people and saying, okay, it may be too good to be true, but I don't ask too many questions because this is really good for me. Instead of it raising that issue of, gee, this doesn't seem right, let me look into it. It's like, okay, this doesn't seem right, but I'm making money off it, so I'm not going to ask any questions,
And Sam Bankman-Fried was just, it seems almost destined to happen because we do not, as a society, learn any lessons. And it's happening ever more frequently in many ways.
No, there's a financial crisis every 5 to 8 years, and there's many Ponzi schemes and frauds that happen routinely. I mean, it's,
Well, it sounds like you have a Sam Bankman-Fried doc in your future.
I don't know. Maybe. I think it's been so heavily covered, and one of the reasons I wanted to do the Madoff show is because I don't think people really understand just how simple the Ponzi was, which makes it so extraordinary that it went on for so long. And again, people think, oh, Bernie was this fraudulent guy. No, there was a lot of co-conspirators. There were multiple hedge funds that should have known better. JP Morgan Chase, the Ponzi scheme was all that money in and out was one bank account called the famous 703 account, which is the last three numbers of the bank account was 703. So it's called the 703 account. But normally when you have billions of dollars going in and out of a checking account, any transaction that's suspicious, that's over $10,000, usually generates what's called a suspicious activity report. It is a fundamental tenet of banking. You need to know your customer, and they should be monitoring. And the reason the transactions looked funky was there was no counterparty. It was just money moving back and forth between entities and very large, within Bernie's sphere. And it should have raised some red flags.
Well, I mean, of course. I mean, my bank gets in touch with me if I go to a different part of the country and spend a little bit more than I usually do. So
I can tell you. I can tell you if and that account had billions and billions of dollars flowing through it, and I can tell you if that bank account was, if the business behind that bank account was in Mexico, they would assume it was, or be suspicious about drug cartel money or something like that. And it would have generated suspicious activity reports. Now, I can't say that I feel Chase knew there was a Ponzi scheme, but all the mechanisms in place to do the normal due diligence were cast aside because it was too profitable to have billions of dollars in cash flowing through your bank, is my opinion.
I want to get back to the point about the simplicity of his Ponzi scheme, but we'll give our listeners a quick break. We'll be right back with Joe Berlinger, exec producer and director of the new Netflix docu-series Madoff, The Monster of Wall Street, streaming on Netflix from January 4th.
You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America.
Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with award-winning filmmaker Joe Berlinger, executive producer and director of the new Netflix docuseries Madoff, The Monster of Wall Street, streaming on Netflix from January 4th. We're talking about Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme, which you've defined what a Ponzi scheme extremely well to our listeners, but just to put it in even more stark terms, he didn't invest a dime, right? I mean, it's not a single dime of it got invested anywhere except in his pocket.
That's the interesting. The other Ponzi schemes in history were like often a guy is trading and he's just makes some bad trades and loses money, and it kind of morphs into a Ponzi scheme. The fascinating thing about Bernie's Ponzi scheme is that literally from day one, there was literally no investment. He was just taking people's money, creating fake statements, literally going into this is, in the, before computers or whatever, he would look at the newspaper, or his minions would, look at the newspaper and based on historical information, anyone can bet on yesterday's horse race and win, obviously. And that's what he was doing. He would, go back to historical data, pick a time to buy the stock and a time to sell the stock fictitiously, because he actually wasn't doing either, and put that down on a statement and send it off to people,
And the thing is, he didn't have to do it, did he? I mean, he had this legit business, relatively legit business that was doing really well. He was the toast of Wall Street. I think he was head of NASDAQ for a little while. But yet to go to all this not to give no spoiler alert, spoiler alert maybe, but it's a great scene where you talk about these two floors where the activity had his legit business on what is the 19th floor, and then this Ponzi scheme's on the 17th floor, and the guy said it's like going back in time. But they went, the amount of effort he had to go through to create these false trades to keep this thing going. He could have probably done all right without doing this. Why did he do it?
That is the sad reality. Nobody really knows when the Ponzi scheme began. I personally think from day one, from the day he, when he was a very young man, he decided to open up shop and become a stockbroker in the wild days of the stock market. And he invested poorly, and there was a crash in 1962, and he lost all of his customers' money, which at the time was only $30,000. But, in 62, $30,000 for a young man is a lot of money. His father-in-law bailed him out and loaned him the $30,000 to give back to his clients. But he decided to not tell his clients the truth. In other words, everyone else lost a shitload of money because of this big crash that happened. And he told his clients he got out at the right time and sent them back their money with even a little profit, and he looked like a genius. And he decided that guiding principle, he decided he'd rather be a liar than a failure, because failure haunted him. His father was a failure. And so he was motivated by not being a failure. So I think the Ponzi scheme began early, or playing with the fast and loose with the rules began very early. He always had two businesses, a legitimate business and a business on the side managing other people's money. He was a broker in the 60s, which all that meant was he would buy and sell stocks and make a little money on the spread. But in addition to that, he had a side business as an investment advisor. In the 70s, he became a market maker, which is the buyer and seller of a stock of last resort. That's a legitimate business, but on the side, he continued to have this investment advisory business, and the two businesses kind of grew in parallel. So I think he was always playing with the rules, and at some point, it turned into a Ponzi scheme. But his legitimate business, as you said, would have made him a very successful person. That's the irony of this whole thing. He was one of the big advocates and innovators of electronic trading. The stock market fundamentally changed when it got computerized. What took weeks, literally in the old days, a transaction took weeks, and you physically mailed stock certificates to the buyer. And now it's become electronic trading, and he was a big innovator in that. And he also took all the off-the-market exchanges, and what I mean by that is not the official New York Stock Exchange or American Stock Exchange, but all these smaller exchanges where it was kind of a wild west. There was no price transparency. You didn't, a stock could be sold for one price in Boston, another price in Dallas, another price in New York. It was very risky and opaque until computerized trading. And so all these off the market exchanges all became kind of one computer screen, so to speak, where there was extreme price transparency. And that is the forerunner of what became the NASDAQ market. And the NASDAQ market kind of, is one of the big markets now. Apple, Google, Microsoft all trade on the NASDAQ. And he was one of the big innovators that he was, 3 times the head of NASDAQ. Why somebody like this would choose to do this is an interesting look into psychology. Bernie himself claims it only became a Ponzi scheme when his legitimate business, in the late 80s, early 90s, started having some solvency issues, and he took investment advisory money and funneled it to his legitimate business to shore it up. Actually, that was late 90s, early 2000s. That to me sounds way too convenient. I think he was guilty of this Ponzi scheme for decades.
Well, and as you say, he was always sort of operating outside of the law with this other side, this advisory side of things anyway. So, and there's good examples of that throughout the doc. I mean, we're not going to have too much more of your time, I think, but how do you make, you as a filmmaker, how do you make financial fraud interesting?
I don't know. Tell me, was it interesting?
Well, I mean, yes, it was very interesting. I have to say that I've got an economics background, so it kind of comes to me. I like dramas like Margin Call and those kind of things that have been done well. But it's not the easiest thing to do, and you've got a maths that Harry, I forget his name, but the derivatives guy who was reporting Madoff to the SEC all the time. Yeah. He comes across really well and interesting. You've got some great people that come on camera. I mean, how do you do that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, we'll see if this translates for people. I mean, I personally, interestingly, or maybe it's only interesting to me, perhaps, but I've actually been quite a bit of a stock market geek over the years. As early as my teens, I was buying stocks, and I've been fascinated by the stock market and the financial markets. So, it's something that I'm quite knowledgeable about. So I think that helped me be able to talk to people so that things could be explained. I do think the big achievement of the show is that very complex concepts are delivered in a way that I don't think it's too hard to understand the content. And that's what I wanted to bring this to life, because again, most people think of this story as like one evil genius who manipulated the markets. But to me, it's a much deeper story. Because I'm knowledgeable enough about the markets that to me, the red flags were so obvious to anybody who is in the business. I wanted to dissect the Ponzi and how it worked and what all those red flags were and why it's representative of such incompetence or worse on the part of a lot of institutions who should have known better. Because if you can explain it in a way that you can understand, then I wanted people to understand just how easy it is to manipulate and cheat the system, in part as a cautionary tale, so that people become very, take control of their finances and understand just, Wall Street is not your friend. I mean, you can have a good business relationship with Wall Street, but they are not there to look out for you. They are there to make money. And so there's certain basic rules of investing that I hope translate to people from watching the show. Like very simple things, like if you don't know what you're investing in, you shouldn't invest in it. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. And Bernie's reported returns were just ridiculous. Never a down year. That's just mathematically impossible in finance. And diversification. One of the reasons so many people got hurt badly is that it wasn't like they had 10% of their money with Bernie. They had their entire life savings. So even forgetting a Ponzi scheme, just in general, if you were 90% in one particular stock, like Facebook, in the last year, you got killed, because Facebook collapsed stock price wise. So just people should understand that fraud happens a lot, and that Wall Street does not have your back. I'm not saying don't invest, and places like Charles Schwab or Fidelity or these major institutions that people, I think those are all fine, and I generally trust that system. But anything that's outside of the norm, you gotta really think twice about.
Joe, I think you're gonna have to do an investment podcast or something. Just talk to us, and I feel like almost we're gonna need to put all those little disclaimers at the bottom of this episode just to let people know. But so yeah, I think we are coming to the end of our time. So I want to thank you again. For coming on. One last question, if I may. Some would call you a pioneer. I know you have many imitators, or at least in terms of just generally in terms of true crime and these sort of things. How did, now that you put on Netflix and you see all this stuff on out there, and some of it yours, obviously, but how do you stand out from the crowd these days, or do you worry about that? Or maybe what's the key to making a good doc these days?
I don't pay attention to what other people do, or think to myself, how do I stand out from the crowd? I've been lucky enough to be doing this for 30 years, and I just do what interests me, and I hope it interests other people. We do seem to be in kind of a peak true crime moment. When I was my first film was Brother's Keeper in 1992. That Bruce Sinofsky and I made, and it went to Sundance and won a prize, but nobody wanted to release it. So we self-distributed the film ourselves, believing in the film, and, schlepped 35 millimeter prints from theater to theater. And if 400 people watched our movie in a weekend, we'd high five each other and felt like we died and went to heaven. Oh my God, 400 people saw our movie. Yeah. Wow. That's great. Now you push something out on Netflix and hundreds of millions of people see it, and the crime stuff in particular is super popular. So I just feel very lucky to be continuing to do what I do. And, one day if people stop liking it, then I'll go sit on a beach somewhere.
Okay. Well, I think even if it falls a bit out of favor, I think we'll still be. I don't think your films will be. So thank you again for joining us. It's been a pleasure having Joe Berlinger, the director of the new Netflix docu-series Madoff, The Monster of Wall Street. Thanks again for joining us, and it's streaming. Just to remind you, it's streaming on Netflix from January 4th. I also would like to thank those who helped make this podcast possible. A big shout out to Sam and Joe at Intersound Audio in York, England. Big thanks to Amy Ord, our podcast manager at Alamo Pictures, who ensures we continue getting great guests onto the show and that everything otherwise runs smoothly. Finally, a big thanks to our listeners. Many of you have been with us for 4 incredible seasons. Please keep sending us feedback and episode ideas, whether it is on YouTube, social media, or directly by email. Please also remember to like us and share us with your friends and family, wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off.
You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.